Sit down in the family section, Kara. You are not part of this. If you stand up again, I will have security drag you out in front of everyone." His voice cut through the ceremony like a blade, snapping against metal, sharp, loud, absolute. Colonel David Mercer did not whisper. He did not try to hide it. He threw the words across the rows of chairs at Peterson Space Force Base with the confidence of a man who believed no one would dare question him. The brass band had just finished a march. The flags were rippling hard in the wind. Families were rising to take pictures of their sons and daughters in uniform, and there I was being shoved back into my seat like a trespasser in a place I had every right to stand. My knees buckled slightly and my hand caught the edge of the chair. A few spouses in the row ahead turned around smirking as if I had broken some unspoken rule. One of them whispered to the other while glancing directly at me. That girl again. If she was actually military, she would not be hiding back here. Another one laughed under her breath. She is a keyboard soldier. That is what she is. My throat tightened. The sun was beating down on the back of my neck, and my uniform jacket, which I had folded neatly beside me, suddenly felt like a weight pressing into my ribs, like something I had not earned. My fingers curled around the seat until they trembled. I kept my head level. I did not blink. I had spent years learning how to swallow the taste of his humiliation. Mercer leaned in just enough that I felt the shadow of his cap slide across my cheek. His voice dropped lower, colder, more deliberate. "If you move from that seat, I will make one call. We will see how long your precious clearance lasts." Clearance. The word landed like a punch to the sternum. Clearance was not a privilege to me. It was years of lost sleep and classified exams and training cycles where I was pushed past the point I thought I could break. He knew exactly what he was threatening. He always did. I stared straight ahead, and the ceremony blurred slightly at the edges. Officers' names being called, applause, boots hitting pavement in rehearsed formation, and here, in the section labeled Family, with a flimsy laminated sign clipped to a folding chair, I sat like a child being scolded in public. My stepfather, the man who had spent half my life reminding me that I was less than him, had chosen today, of all days, a military ceremony to make sure everyone around us knew it too. My cousin leaned forward 2 rows down, pretending to adjust her sunglasses, while saying just loud enough to be overheard. Honestly, if Kara did anything important, we would know. Important people do not sit back here, they walk out there. She nodded toward the formation on the field. Someone behind me snorted. Heat prickled across my scalp. I kept breathing evenly, in through the nose, slow, controlled. The way they taught us in training. The way I had trained myself, because losing control in front of Mercer only fueled him more. A vibration buzzed against my hip, my phone. I slid it slightly from my pocket just enough to see the preview. Ops. The message was short, coded, simple. Specter command inbound. Stand by. For a moment I forgot the heat and the humiliation, and Mercer's voice still echoing in my ears. My pulse jumped once hard. Not from fear, from recognition. Another world, the one beyond family dinners and Sunday scoldings and men yelling to prove their power, had just entered the field. I tucked the phone away before Mercer noticed. He was still staring at me, waiting to see if I would flinch. I did not. The ceremony continued. Names, ranks, applause. A presenter's voice carried over the speakers. The family section felt tighter with every passing minute, a narrow pen where people like me were expected to smile politely and not disturb the illusion of a perfect military family. This was the only moment I allowed myself a single quiet thought. My name is Kara Whitmore, 25, active duty Air Force intel. In this house, though, I have never been anything except the girl my stepfather ordered back into her place. A burst of movement near the back caught my eye. Several officers had entered the ceremony area through the side gate. Their uniforms were pressed sharp, their pace deliberate. They approached the event coordinator, who stiffened immediately. One of the officers, a major, leaned in to speak. His voice carried across the rows. "We were told Specter would be in the family section. Where is Whitmore?" My heart slammed once, then steadied. The wind caught the corner of the family section sign and flipped it upward with a sudden loud crack. Mercer either did not hear them or did not understand. He muttered under his breath, "Keep your head down, Kara. Do not make trouble today." But I had already heard my call sign spoken aloud in a place where no one, including him, had ever expected it to be. For the first time in 25 years, I did not bow my head to his threat. Because this time I knew something he did not. If you have ever been told to sit down and stay quiet in a family that used your silence as their comfort, stay with me. And if you already feel this in your chest, tell me still here in the comments so I know I am not alone. Mom remarried when I was 10. By then, Colonel David Mercer had already decided the world only made sense if he was in charge of it. Our house in the Pueblo suburbs outside Colorado Springs looked like the kind of place people driving by would call a perfect military family. The flag by the mailbox was always straightened. The truck in the garage was washed every Saturday. The lawn trimmed until blades of grass stood like they feared inspection. On the outside, it was order. On the inside, it was a miniature boot camp built around one man's appetite for control. Dinner was at 6 on the dot. Chairs had to be pulled out quietly. Forks could not scrape. Elbows never touched the table. If my mother laughed too loudly, Mercer would clear his throat and the sound would fall out of her mouth like a mistake. If I asked a question he did not like, he would tilt his head in that slow, familiar way and say, "You do not talk back to me. You listen and learn." When I was 12, the insults began their steady rise like he had been waiting for me to reach an age where his words could land with maximum weight. "You are soft," he said one night when I hesitated before answering him. "If you were one of my soldiers, I would smoke you until you cried." The way he said it made it clear that crying would only prove his point. At 13, he slammed his hand on the table so hard my fork jumped and clattered. My mother let out a small laugh that was not a laugh at all, but a plea to keep the evening from collapsing. He stared at me with a look that said any discomfort he caused was simply discipline. Any fear I felt was weakness I needed to fix. By 14, the comparisons had become routine. Look at Staff Sergeant Miller's son, already in ROTC. What are you hiding in your room with books? Every compliment he gave to another kid was a weapon pointed at me. Every achievement someone else had was proof that I was falling behind an invisible standard only he measured. I learned quickly that silence made the room safer. I watched my mother shrink a little each day, her shoulders folding inward when she heard his boots on the entryway tile. I could tell his mood by the pressure in his footsteps before he even entered the room. These were not things I was taught. They were things I absorbed because survival in that house meant learning to read the weather in his presence. I did not cry loudly or argue. Instead, I felt something quieter forming in me, a numbness that spread in thin layers every time he reminded me I was not enough. While he built his authority through orders and volume, I built a different kind of strength in silence. Small things revealed themselves early. I could solve logic puzzles faster than kids older than me. I fixed the old radio in the kitchen by taking it apart without instructions. Once when Mercer restricted my screen time, I hacked the router's parental controls without touching the password. My mother was startled and impressed. Mercer dismissed it with a scoff. Playing with computers will not get you anywhere. The irony that he depended on me to fix his email settings twice that month was lost on him. To him, intelligence only mattered if it came packaged the way he approved loud, commanding, muscular. If it did not look like his version of service, it did not count. The older I grew, the more I understood that nothing I did would ever be enough inside that house. When I got good grades, he said I had too much free time. When I stayed quiet, he said I lacked initiative. When I spoke up, he said I was disrespectful. It was a maze designed to make me run into the same wall no matter which turn I chose. Still, I kept watching. I watched my mother hand him her paycheck each month while he tucked it into a drawer she never opened. I watched him speak to neighbors with charm and ease, only to let his face fall into irritation the moment the door closed. I watched the way he used his rank to bend conversations to his liking, even at barbecues, even in the grocery line, even when the topic had nothing to do with service. And I watched something else too, something he never realized was growing in me. I learned the outlines of power, not the kind he wielded loudly, but the kind that moved quietly underneath decisions and rules and systems he did not even understand. I learned how small details could shift outcomes, how information gave shape to leverage, how remembering what people underestimated about you was sometimes the sharpest advantage. He never noticed. To him, I was just Kara, the girl who hid in her room with books and computers, the girl who could never meet the standards he had written for a life that was not mine. So when he stood in front of me the day I turned 15, arms crossed, uniform still crisp from work, and said, "You need to toughen up if you ever want to survive the real world," I said nothing, but inside something clicked. He was right about one thing, though. He would never believe how I interpreted it. If power was the only language he respected, I decided I would learn to speak it better than he ever could. I left for basic at Lackland the week I turned 18. He did not hug me. He just said, "Do not wash out. I do not raise quitters." His voice followed me all the way through airport security and into the humid Texas air that wrapped around the training grounds like a warning. Basic was hotter than anything I had known in Colorado. The sun baked the pavement until it shimmered. The cadence calls cracked through the air from dawn until lights out. Boots thudded against asphalt, rhythmic and relentless. Sweat collected under my collar and soaked through my socks. At night, the barracks hummed with exhaustion, bodies dropping into bunks, still trembling from drills. The first week I learned how quickly a mistake could turn into an exercise of consequence. A dropped water bottle meant push-ups until arms trembled. A hesitation in formation meant corrective runs that carved circles through the fields under a sky that looked too big to belong to anyone. But something in that harsh rhythm made sense to me in a way Mercer's house never had. Rules were clear, consequences were consistent. You could earn respect here not by shouting the loudest, but by showing up every day willing to push through whatever was asked. And without even trying, I began to stand out. Instructors noticed I mastered tasks faster than expected: land navigation, map reading, analyzing small bits of information and stitching them into something coherent. While others struggled to interpret grid coordinates, I solved them almost instantly. When we were tested on memory, I logged details and patterns without effort. A training sergeant narrowed his eyes at me one afternoon after a time data analysis drill. He tapped my result sheet with the back of his pen. "You do not think like most recruits, Whitmore." That was the first time anyone in a position of authority had said my name with something other than irritation. A few weeks later, another instructor pulled me aside after class. "You ever consider intel or cyber work?" she asked. "You have the mind for it." She recommended me for further screening. The process was long, full of interviews, written tests, simulations, and evaluations that pushed my brain harder than basic had pushed my body. When the answer finally came, it was simple. I was approved for the intel pathway. The first time I held that assignment letter, it felt heavier than paper should. Not because of weight, but because it was something I had earned entirely on my own. No one had pushed me there. No one had told me I was destined for it. No one had even believed I could do something like this. After tech school, I received my stationing orders. Colorado Springs, close to NORAD and Schriever, close to the heart of operations I had only read about. On my first day reporting in, a captain glanced over my file, then lowered his voice. "You will be working with some things we do not put in brochures. You will do well." He walked away before I could ask what that meant. He did not need to explain. The classified atmosphere, the controlled access areas, the secured hallways said enough. There was a world here most people never saw, and somehow I had been trusted with a key to it. The first time I went home on leave, I thought maybe something would be different. Maybe the distance and the uniform and the training would shift something in the air. I sat at my mother's kitchen table sipping coffee while she beamed as she asked about my new position. I tried to explain the basics without revealing anything sensitive. It is intel work, I told her. A lot of analysis, a lot of real-time decision support. Before she could say more, Mercer cut in with a laugh that had no humor in it. So you sit behind a screen. That is not real service. Real soldiers bleed. My mother's smile fell, though she tried to hide it by stirring her cup. I swallowed the sting that crawled up my chest. The uniform in my duffel felt suddenly small, insufficient, like something he had already stripped the value from. I did not argue with him. I never did. Instead, I felt that familiar ache just beneath my ribs, the one that reminded me there were two versions of me in this world. On base, they called me Whitmore, with respect. In briefings, people twice my age listened when I spoke. My opinion mattered. My work mattered. But in that house, in that kitchen, under Mercer's gaze, I was still the girl who did not measure up. The girl he had spent years training to believe she never would. It was jarring to live inside two realities that refused to overlap. Out there, I was building a life defined by structure, purpose, and earned responsibility. In here, I was dragged back to the version of myself he preferred insignificant and quiet. When I left that night, the porch light flickered against the truck he had polished earlier. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, as if inspecting me for faults before letting me go. I walked to my car without looking back. The next morning, when I returned to base, the gate guard checked my ID, nodded with a quiet welcome back, and something in me steadied. I belonged in one of these places, and it was not the house I had grown up in. He thought I had chosen the military to be closer to him. I had not. I had chosen it to prove to myself more than to him that I could survive something harsher than his house. By 22, I had my own off-base apartment in Colorado Springs, and a steady rhythm that felt almost predictable missions during the week, debriefs in small secured rooms where the lights were always a little too bright, and the obligatory Sunday dinners at my mother's house, where the air always felt heavier than anywhere else in the city. Sunday dinners were the same every week: grilled meat potato salad that wilted too quickly on the counter, and ESPN murmuring in the background like a second authority. The moment I walked through the door, Mercer would glance at my boots, then at my face as if inspecting me for something he could criticize. "Sit down," he would say without warmth. "And do not talk about what you do. No one cares about your classified nonsense." My cousins would start talking loudly about their jobs in civilian contracting, good salaries, flexible schedules, travel perks. One of them bragged about a recent bonus and how he might use it for a trip to Miami. They always seemed louder when I came home, as if volume could establish superiority. They asked no questions about my work, not that I could tell them much, but even the polite curiosity was missing. Mercer liked it that way. He liked being the focal point, the one who had served the one who knew everything worth knowing. The more they spoke, the smaller the room seemed to get, as if their words were filling the space meant for oxygen. I kept my breathing steady. I ate slowly and kept my shoulders straight. My mother moved quietly around the table, refilling glasses, setting out more food, making sure Mercer never had to ask for anything. It was during one of those dinners that I noticed her sliding her paycheck envelope across the counter toward him. He tucked it into a drawer where he kept her debit card, her receipts, her financial life. She had an allowance, small and tightly monitored. When she needed groceries, she asked. When she wanted to visit a friend, she asked. When her car needed repairs, she waited for him to decide if it mattered enough to fix. One Sunday afternoon, as she washed dishes beside me, I whispered just loud enough for her to hear Mom, "You should have your own account." She hesitated, the sponge pausing in her hand. "I can help you open one. You do not need his permission." I did not hear Mercer walk in, but I felt the shift in the air before his voice hit. "What are you two whispering about?" He stepped closer, and his eyes narrowed. When he spotted the envelope still on the counter, his jaw tightened. "In this house, money runs through me. You do not like it. Do not show up." His palm struck the counter, making a sharp thud. My mother flinched. I stepped back, forcing myself to keep my face neutral. I had faced harsher pressure in mission rooms, but nothing made my pulse tighten like watching him crush her independence under the guise of order. A week later, I made the mistake of arriving in my uniform. I had been on call earlier that day and had not had time to change before coming over. My mother's eyes lit up for a moment when she saw me standing at the door. I thought maybe she felt proud, even if she could not say it out loud. But Mercer's expression froze into something colder than irritation. "Take that off at my table. You have not seen enough to wear that in front of me." My throat tightened. The uniform I had earned, the uniform I wore to support missions that required precision and judgment, was apparently an offense in his house. I slipped off the outer jacket, quietly folding it over my arm and sitting at the table in a plain shirt. The gesture was small, but the humiliation radiated through me like a bruise beneath the skin. He watched with satisfaction. That was the worst part. I wanted to say I see more in that operations cell than you will in your entire guard career, but the words stayed locked behind my teeth. Instead, I chewed slower, steady the way I did during stressful missions when I needed to regulate my breathing. My fingers tightened slightly around my water glass enough that it trembled when I set it down. None of them noticed. None of them ever did. Then halfway through dinner, my phone lit up with a secure alert. The ringtone was subtle, almost unnoticeable to anyone who did not know what it meant. I stood quickly stepping into the hallway before answering. "Specter online," I said. "Yes, sir," Target confirmed. The instructions were short, direct. My role was clear. When I returned to the table, the room felt different. Mercer stared at me with an amused curl at the edge of his mouth. Cute nickname. Still does not make you important. He said it lightly, but each syllable dug deeper than he realized. Specter was not cute. It was earned through hours of classified work and decisions that impacted real lives. It was trust, poured from commanders I respected. But to him, it was a punchline, something to chip away my sense of worth. I stayed quiet, finishing the last of my food, tasting nothing. My mother kept her eyes on her plate, afraid to look up and risk drawing attention. When dinner ended, I walked out into the cool night air before anyone could stop me. The porch light flickered above me like it always did, half functioning but never fixed. I opened the door of my car and sat for a moment without starting the engine. My uniform jacket was still folded on the passenger seat, crisp clean, untouched by the house I had just left. I rested my hand on it, feeling the weight not of fabric, but of the difference between the world I served and the world I came from. That night, I drove back to my apartment with my uniform folded on the passenger seat, wondering how a stranger at work could trust me with lives while the man in my kitchen could not trust me with my own voice. On base, nobody called me Kara. They called me Specter. The name carried through the secured hallways in a low, even tone, the way people spoke when they understood something mattered, but did not dare ask why. The operations floor was always cool, lit by rows of monitors that washed everything in shades of blue and white. Maps shifted in real time across large screens, while smaller feeds displayed UAV visuals, signal intercepts, and time-stamped movement trails. Keyboards clicked without rhythm because the work did not wait for rhythm. Teams breathed in unison, as if exhaling too loudly might disrupt the fragile balance of a mission half a world away. My seat was in the center row, close enough for supervisors to tap me on the shoulder when something shifted. It often did. I could see patterns before others articulated them. Sometimes it was a change in heat signature barely noticeable unless you had stared at thousands. Sometimes it was the way a convoy slowed too evenly, suggesting a roadblock or an ambush site. Sometimes it was a missing data packet that felt wrong even when the system flagged nothing. One afternoon, an alert streamed in, showing a strike package preparing for release somewhere in a conflict zone where the borders were blurred by years of fighting. The coordinates had been verified twice. The team on the ground was already repositioning. Nothing looked unusual at first, but something about the satellite heat bloom made the hairs rise on my arms. I zoomed in, dragging the feed frame by frame. There was movement beneath the roofline of a building that should have been empty, not soldiers. The pacing was wrong. Smaller, slower. Children. I checked the date of the last reconnaissance pass and realized the school hours had shifted that week because of a local holiday. The building slated for targeting was being used temporarily as a learning site. 5 civilians inside, maybe more. I recalculated the coordinate drift and noticed a half-degree misalignment caused by a faulty atmospheric correction file. The strike would land short. It would hit the school instead. My voice cut through the room the way it did when training had stripped hesitation from me. Stop the release, recompute grid, wrong correction index. The supervisor rushed over looking at my screen, then swore under his breath. He contacted the strike cell immediately. Abort was called with seconds to spare. The room held its breath until confirmation came through. No ordnance released, civilians safe. Only after that did the operations chief walk over and plant his hands on the back of my chair. "You just saved us from an international incident, Specter." His voice was low but loaded, the kind of tone that did not need applause to communicate gravity. Later that week, a commendation was drafted, but the document held only 3 words where the explanation should have been. Details classified. When they handed it to me, a colonel whose name never appeared on public rosters added quietly, "You will not be up on stage getting a medal for this. But trust me, people who matter know your name." It was strange carrying a career defined by silence. I did not have stories I could bring to Sunday dinner, no photos to show, no lines on a resume that could explain what my days really looked like. My victories happened in rooms with no windows, witnessed only by people whose expressions rarely shifted. Yet in those rooms, I was respected, trusted, needed. And every time I heard someone say, "Good work," Specter, a small crack formed in the wall Mercer had built inside me. He had once said I was not important. But here, the mission logs told a different story. I could steer the trajectory of an entire operation with a single correction. I could prevent deaths with a few lines of analysis. I could see things coming before they appeared on maps. I did not need recognition to know what that meant. I only needed the quiet nods from the people who signed the orders and the steady confidence of those who executed them. In the rare, still moments between operations, I found myself comparing the 2 worlds I lived in. In one world, my value was measured by my competence, my judgment, and the trust placed in me by commanders who never raised their voices. In the other world, my value was measured by how well I stayed silent at a dinner table that did not want to hear me. The contrast was sharp enough to hurt. I began studying more than mission logs. I learned chain of command regulations. I learned how personnel protections worked. I read through JAG guidance about abuse obstruction and actions that threatened the stability of someone's career or clearance. I did not read these things with revenge in mind yet. I read them because knowledge was armor and I had spent too long letting someone else define power. In time, I understood that the military had systems for justice, even if they were slow. There were ways to report coercion patterns of intimidation disruptions to a service member's stability. Things Mercer had done for years without consequence. Things I had accepted because I thought no one would believe me. But Specter understood rules. Specter understood structure. Specter understood how to gather evidence. I spent my days quietly steering missions no one would ever know I had touched. I did not realize yet that one day, that same quiet power would be the thing that finally shook my stepfather's world. My mother called on a Thursday evening just as I was finishing a shift that had left my eyes stinging from hours of screen light. Her voice came through bright and excited in a way I had not heard in months, and for a moment I let myself relax because she only sounded like that when she was trying very hard to believe something good was happening. "Kara," she said, "your stepfather was invited to a ceremony on base. They are recognizing a few units. Family can come too. There will be a lot of important people there. You should come." The word important landed strangely. It always did. Before I could answer, she added softly, "I would be proud to have you there." Proud. That one word carried more weight than she realized because it had been years since she used it without watching Mercer's face first. I felt something loosen and tighten at the same time. I wanted to tell her yes before anything spoiled the moment, but then I heard footsteps and the shuffle of a phone being taken from her hand. Mercer's voice cut through the line, heavy and sharpened by his usual assumption of authority. If you come remember, you are there as family, not as some pretend operator. Pretend was a new blade and it slid exactly where he wanted it to. My jaw tightened, but I did not respond. He waited a beat, then added, "You sit where family sits. You clap when told. Do not embarrass us." The line clicked as he handed the phone back or perhaps just walked away. My mother returned and asked if I was still there, and I forced my voice steady long enough to say I will think about it. After hanging up, I stood in the hallway outside ops, letting the fluorescent lights hum above me. My first instinct was to refuse. I had spent much of my adult life reducing the hours I spent in that house, and the thought of sitting through a ceremony beside him made my stomach tighten. But the image of my mother sitting alone next to him, surrounded by people who believed his version of our family, pushed through my reluctance. I knew what she looked like when she tried not to flinch. I knew what kind of smile she used when she pretended to belong somewhere she did not. Duty and self-respect pulled in opposite directions, threading tension through my chest. I did not want to go. I also did not want her facing him without someone in her corner. Later that night, when I checked my work email, I saw a message flagged high priority. Command staff may request you on site for a brief during Saturday's ceremony. Standby authorization attached. The timing was too precise to ignore. Something was moving in the background of my professional world, and though the message was vague, it hinted at a need for my presence on base, regardless of the personal chaos waiting for me there. It was the first quiet confirmation that my two worlds were about to collide in a way I could not fully predict. The next morning, I checked the schedule and filed a request to be off the operations floor during the ceremony hours, while remaining on standby if command needed me. The approval came quickly without questions, which only raised more of my own. On Saturday, I prepared slowly, choosing not to wear my uniform because I knew exactly how Mercer would react to that. Instead, I selected a simple outfit, neutral and unprovocative, something that would not attract attention, yet would not make me feel like I had diminished myself. I tied my hair back neatly, watched my reflection for a long moment, and tried to quiet the creeping dread that came with returning to any event involving him. On the drive to Peterson Space Force Base, I stopped at a Starbucks just off the highway, a place I had gone to more times than I could count during deployments and long shifts. As I waited for my drink, I caught myself looking out the window at the base entrance down the road. I had passed through those gates hundreds of times with my badge, my uniform, and the weight of classified work pressing at my shoulders. But today I was entering as something else, family. A label he had always used as a form of confinement, not connection. I sat in the parking lot for a moment, letting the sun warm the steering wheel while I thought about how many versions of myself had driven onto that base. The trainee unsure of her steps, the analyst learning to read data like a second language, the Specter who saved missions quietly without applause, and now the daughter who would be expected to sit small and silent in a designated section meant more for optics than belonging. I started the engine and merged into traffic, feeling the tension rise with every mile. As I approached the gate, the security forces member scanned my ID and handed it back with a polite welcome. For a brief moment, I was only Airman Whitmore again, and the irony of that familiarity just before entering a situation where I would be treated like I did not belong made something hollow ring inside my chest. Driving toward the ceremony area, I saw families gathering under tents, children weaving between rows of folding chairs and service members in full uniform standing tall in the brightness of the Colorado sun. It should have been a proud scene. For most people it was. For me, it was the stage he had chosen. The family section sign was visible even from the parking area. The words looked harmless, but I knew better. That section was not just a seating arrangement, it was a boundary, a reminder of hierarchy according to him, the place where I was supposed to stay quiet and manageable. I took a breath, steady and purposeful, then stepped out of the car, gathering my bag and my composure before walking toward the gathering crowd. With every step, I felt the push and pull inside me, the part that wanted to protect my mother, the part that no longer wanted to shrink. I told myself I could survive 3 hours of pretending. I did not know he had been planning to use those same 3 hours to remind everyone I would never be one of them. The ceremony grounds stretched wide across the main lawn of Peterson Space Force Base, with rows of folding chairs already filled by the time I reached the family section. Flags lined the perimeter, snapping sharply each time the Colorado wind gathered force. A speaker system crackled as the announcer read the names of officers being recognized. Every few seconds, the crowd rose in applause and sat back down in a wave of motion that felt almost rehearsed. I slipped into an empty seat beside my mother and tried to steady my breathing, but the moment Mercer saw me, he shifted his chair just enough to make it clear this was his space, and I was intruding in it. The sun was bright overhead, glinting off uniforms and medals, while civilians fanned themselves with printed programs. The whole setting was orderly and proud, and completely at odds with the tension knotting between my ribs. When the formation marched into place, the subtle tremor of boots thudding in sync traveled through the ground. I leaned forward, wanting a better view of the squadron flag, but before I could rise from my seat, Mercer's hand clamped around my wrist. "Sit," he growled low enough that only those beside us could hear. Family section means you sit, smile, and clap when told. His grip was not tight enough to bruise, yet firm enough to remind me that he believed he owned the right to control even the angle of my posture. I eased back into the chair, silently removing my wrist from his grasp. "Do not make a scene," he added with a forced smile that did not touch his eyes. "You have embarrassed this family enough." The words carried the familiar sting of something he had told me in different forms for years. My mother shifted slightly as if bracing for my reaction, though she knew I would not give him one. I stared straight ahead, pretending to study the banner stretched between 2 poles. "Honoring excellence," it read. The irony was sharp. A cousin seated behind us leaned toward another relative and whispered loudly enough for the sound to reach me. I mean, if she really did something important, we would know, right? Someone else chuckled. Intel like those kids who play War on Computers. The laughter that followed was soft but pointed. I kept my eyes fixed on the stage. The announcer called out another rank and the crowd rose to clap. Metal chair legs scraped against the ground in uneven rhythm. The sound grated against my nerves. When everyone sat again, I let myself feel the details, the wind teasing the edges of the flags, the faint creak of the chair under me, the heat creeping up my neck, the cold prickle settling into my hands. My jaw tightened, because reacting would only feed the story he wanted to tell about me. The story that I did not belong here, even though this base, this world was where I had built my real life and earned my real respect. My phone buzzed softly in my pocket. I glanced down, shielding the screen from view. Specter command inbound. Confirm location. The message was simple, but the shift it caused inside me was anything but. A collision of 2 worlds pressed against my ribs, so suddenly it stole a fraction of my breath. Mercer kept his gaze forward, unaware. To him, I was still the girl who needed to be placed in a chair and held there. But to the people sending that message, I was someone they expected to locate quickly in a crowd, someone they relied on not for optics, but for operational readiness. I slipped the phone back into my pocket with a small, controlled inhale. The announcer continued reading names. Applause rose again. My mother clapped politely, though her eyes kept flickering toward me, and then toward Mercer, as if she was checking whether one of us might break. I did not. The wind shifted and carried the faint metallic ring of the flagpole cable, striking its mount. For a few seconds, that small rhythmic sound drowned out everything else, the comments, the forced laughter, the lecture disguised as family pride. When the next round of applause ended and the noise settled, Mercer leaned closer, the corners of his mouth pulled back in something he thought resembled authority. "You will never be one of them, Kara." His voice was steady, absolute certain, a sentence he believed could be carved in stone. I let the words land but did not absorb them. I lifted my head following a subtle movement at the back of the ceremony area. A group of officers had entered quietly from the side gate and were now speaking with security. Their uniforms marked them as higher ranking, and their eyes were scanning the rows methodically. They were not looking for a spectator. They were looking for a name, for a call sign, for me. Inside my chest, something anchored and something else rose calm and sure. He had no idea they were here for me. The officers moved with the kind of purpose that made people instinctively step out of their way. From where I sat in the family section, I watched them speak briefly with a junior airman near the information table. He checked a clipboard, then lifted his head to scan the rows. Even over the murmur of the crowd, I heard the major's voice carry clear and firm. "We are looking for Airman Whitmore. Call sign Specter." For half a second, everything around me went quiet. The flag still snapped in the wind. The announcer still shuffled papers at the podium. The metal chairs still creaked under shifting weight, but all of it felt distant. The airman with the clipboard blinked, then glanced at the laminated seating chart taped to his stand. His eyes moved from the list to the sea of people until they landed on the sign in front of our row. He raised his hand and pointed directly at the family section. "Over there, sir." The major nodded and turned to the man walking beside him, a Brigadier General whose presence drew a ripple through the crowd. People shifted, parted, created a path down the aisle without being asked. The general and his staff began to move along the rows, their uniforms catching the sunlight, their steps measured. As they approached our section, the little sign that read, "Family Section," suddenly looked ridiculous. A flimsy boundary trying to separate those who served from those who only watched. My heart hammered once, then steadied into that same focused rhythm I knew from mission calls. My mother's hand tightened on her program. Mercer straightened in his chair chest, puffed as if he expected this small procession to be about him. The general stopped directly in front of our row and looked down the line of faces until his gaze landed on mine. "Whitmore?" he asked. "Kara Whitmore." My seat felt smaller than ever. I rose carefully, feeling the eyes of everyone around us latch onto the movement. "Yes, sir," I answered. My voice did not shake. The general studied me for a brief moment, then gave a single approving nod. "Specter, we need you." A hush rolled across the nearby rows. The word Specter hung there, visible and heavy like a banner no one had seen being raised. Before I could fully step out, Mercer lurched to his feet, wedging himself slightly between us with that familiar, entitled tilt to his chin. "Sir," he said quickly, "she is just here as family." "She is not." The general did not raise his voice, but the cut of his interruption was sharp enough to slice the rest of Mercer's sentence in half. "Colonel, with respect, Specter is here at the request of command. She is operational." The word operational landed like a gavel. Mercer's mouth snapped shut. The muscles in his jaw jumped, but he said nothing. The general glanced briefly at him, then turned his focus back to me as if deciding where attention actually belonged. "Her work saved an entire unit last month," he added for the benefit of the nearby listeners. "I would like her seated where she belongs." A small wave of reaction moved through the people around us. A cousin who had laughed earlier went silent. The spouses who had called me a keyboard soldier stared with wide eyes. My mother blinked rapidly as if trying to process the fact that someone who outranked Mercer by more than one layer of command had just walked past him to praise the daughter he spent years diminishing. I stepped out of the narrow gap between chairs. To do it, I had to physically walk past Mercer. For a heartbeat, we were aligned in the same small space, his polished shoes inches from mine. He shifted slightly as if unsure whether to block my path or step aside. I did not look at him. I kept my shoulders back and my spine straight and moved forward. For once, he was the one who had to adjust. The aisle felt longer than it was as the general gestured for me to fall in beside him. People leaned back to give us room whispers rising in our wake. I saw the family section sign from a new angle as we walked past and felt something inside me loosen. That label no longer applied. Maybe it never had. At the edge of my vision, I caught Mercer still standing, frozen, half-turned toward us. Half facing the stage, a man suddenly unsure where he belonged in the picture he thought he directed. I did not speak to him. I did not need to. The general and his staff led me forward toward the reserved seating near the front rows, a place marked off for those directly involved in the ceremony and for command. My mother watched from the family section, her hands pressed together around her program like she was afraid to move in case this all evaporated. I met her eyes for a fraction of a second and saw something there I had not seen in years. Not fear, not apology, something closer to relief. We reached the new row, and the general motioned to an open seat. "Specter," he said quietly, "you can stay here with us." The simple phrase, "with us," landed deeper than any compliment had before. As I sat, the announcer at the podium cleared his throat and the ceremony resumed, but the axis of the moment had shifted. No one cared what Mercer thought about real service anymore. The person whose opinion carried weight had already made himself clear without raising his voice or boasting. All my life, Mercer had insisted there was only one chain of command that mattered his. Watching a general ignore him to speak to me was the first time I realized how wrong he had been. The ceremony ended with the usual applause and orderly dispersal toward the exits, but instead of letting me drift back toward the parking lot with the rest of the families, the Brigadier General gestured for me to follow him behind the rows of staging tents near the rear of the parade field. A staff sergeant lifted the flap of a temporary command shelter and held it open as the general stepped inside. I followed, letting the heavy canvas fall shut behind me and the noise of the crowd muted instantly. Inside the room, the air hummed with the low, steady vibration of generators powering a cluster of screens, showing maps, satellite overlays, encrypted chat logs, and real-time feeds scrolling down narrow columns. A folding table was covered with notebooks, a rugged laptop, and a thermos of coffee someone had forgotten to cap tightly. I took a seat where the general indicated. My pulse was finally slowing back down from the moment in front of the crowd, but I still felt the echo of it inside my chest, that strange collision between the world that belittled me and the world that trusted me with things most people would never even hear whispered. The general removed his cover and set it beside a stack of printed briefings, then sat across from me with the posture of someone who had been doing this job for decades. "You already know this," he said, "but the footage does not show the calls you made. The right ones. We are alive because you caught what others missed." His tone was not performative. It was the calm, factual tone of someone stating a line item in a report, but hearing it spoken aloud in that quiet room still hit something deep in me. A young captain standing off to the side straightened when he heard it and looked at me with a kind of respect I had never received in the house where I grew up. I nodded because I had learned not to brush off praise in environments where lives depended on clarity. "Thank you, sir," was all I said. The general leaned back slightly. "Those adjustments you made on the timing of the strike last quarter," he continued, "the ones that prevented a ground team from walking into an ambush." He shook his head as if reliving the moment. "People talk about instinct, but that was not instinct. That was skill and discipline and the kind of pattern analysis we cannot teach easily." The captain glanced at me again, almost like he had heard the story secondhand, but had not known the operator behind it. I did not elaborate. Out there on the parade field, my entire identity had been reduced to whether I was worthy to sit or stand in a folding chair. In here, I was being spoken to as someone whose judgment shaped missions that never reached public news. I felt both realities pressing against each other inside me. The general flipped a page on his tablet, then looked at me more thoughtfully. "Is everything all right at home, Airman?" I noticed some tension out there. The question landed with more weight than he probably intended. I could have unloaded years of insults, control, and belittling, But even in this quiet room, I kept the instinctive discipline that had carried me this far. Let us just say, not everyone understands what we do here, sir. His eyes sharpened with the kind of awareness senior officers develop after decades of reading between lines. He nodded once, accepting the partial truth without pushing. I felt the captain observing us curiously, maybe piecing together that the colonel who had tried to speak over me outside was the same man I had been forced to sit behind for most of my childhood. The general pushed a tablet slightly toward me, showing a few classified summaries of recent operations. None contained my name, but I recognized my work woven through them in coded references. "This is a small circle, Specter," he said quietly, "and we do not forget who keeps that circle steady." I looked at the scattered maps and encrypted chat threads glowing faintly on the screens. Every one of them represented decisions that had required hours of analysis or seconds of instinct decisions no one outside this room would ever know about. And yet the man in the family section had felt entitled to tell me I was not part of anything. The contrast struck harder now that I sat surrounded by the people who had trusted me for years without ever needing to shout their authority. I kept my expression neutral, but inside there was a tight ache rising, a mix of gratitude and old frustration. The general glanced again toward the tent flap where faint sounds from the parade field filtered through the canvas. Families chatting, children laughing, boots on gravel. Then he looked back at me. "Whatever that was out there," he said quietly, "you handle your responsibilities in here with precision. That matters. We see it." For a moment, I did not trust myself to speak. I simply acknowledged him with a steady nod and took a breath that felt fuller than any I had taken all afternoon. I realized then that what had happened on the field was not just humiliating because of Mercer. It was humiliating because it attempted to rewrite the truth of who I had become. The general gathered a few documents, then added in a lower tone, "If anything at home ever interferes with your work or safety, you tell us. We take care of our people. It was not a command. It was an open door." And it hit me that I was hearing from him the exact opposite of what Mercer had spent years drilling into me. In the shelter, the hum of electronics filled the slight pause before the next briefing began. I sat there absorbing the reality that these people trusted me with information that would never see daylight. Information nations argued over in silence. I had not realized until this moment that the darkest thing in my life was not on a classified server or a mission log. It was sitting in the family section waiting to ride my name. The sun was dropping toward the mountains by the time I stepped out of the command tent and crossed back toward the parking lot. The air had cooled just enough for the gravel beneath my boots to crunch more sharply. Families were drifting away in small groups, carrying folded programs, children tugging at sleeves, the last of the applause fading into ordinary bass noise. I spotted my car near the far end of the lot and headed toward it, hoping for a few minutes of silence before I had to process everything that had just happened. I was halfway there when I heard my name in the voice I had spent years training myself not to react to. "Kara, we need to talk." I stopped not because I wanted to, but because I knew he would follow me across the lot if I kept moving. Mercer walked toward me with his hands on his hips, the same posture he used when disciplining junior guardsmen. His sunglasses hung from the front of his uniform, catching the last light. He was not embarrassed. He was not humbled by what had happened out there. He looked irritated, put out, inconvenienced that the world had not spun the way he expected. He stopped a few steps away from me and cleared his throat. "Look," he began. "I might have come off harsh earlier, but we are both in the same world. We both wear the uniform. We could present a united front. It would be good for my next board for your career, too." The audacity of it washed over me in an almost physical wave. He was not apologizing. He was reframing, trying to turn the humiliation he had just put me through into some kind of strategic opportunity for him. He was trying to stand beside the name Specter as if it reflected on him. My silence must have made him uneasy because he kept talking faster now, as if he needed to get the pitch out before I cut him off. A family like ours should look cohesive, he said. It sends a message. Command notices things like that. People talk, boards talk. The subtext was not subtle. He wanted to use me to polish his profile as a model military household, the same profile he had tried to build for years by controlling every inch of our lives. A united front did not mean unity. It meant me, standing where he placed me, to make him look good. I saw the pattern with new clarity. He had used his rank to control my mother. He had used military rhetoric to belittle me. Now he wanted to use my call sign to boost his own reputation. For a moment, the quiet of the parking lot felt like the stillness before a briefing. I could hear distant voices from the field, the low thrum of a generator, the faint tap of a flag against its pole. And then I said what I had been holding in for years. You spent years making sure I knew I was less than you. You do not get to ask for my help now that you know who is actually getting called by command. My voice was calm, not loud, not shaky, just steady in a way that felt unfamiliar and entirely right. He blinked like the words had landed somewhere he did not expect. His mouth tightened. His jaw flexed. He stepped half a foot closer, trying to loom the way he always did in the kitchen, in the hallway, at the dinner table, anytime he wanted someone to shrink so he could feel larger. You think one compliment from a general makes you untouchable, he snapped. Careers end. Clearances get reviewed. I can still make calls. There it was, the old threat dressed in new desperation. He was near the point of breaking, not because I had disobeyed him, but because I had stopped believing he had power over me. The wind shifted, lifting a strand of hair across my cheek, and in the space between his words, I understood something important. He had not changed, not even a little. The man who had belittled me as a child was the same man trying to leverage me now. The difference was no longer him, it was me. I held his gaze without blinking, the first time in my life that I had done so without fear or caution. His face twitched, just slightly, as if the ground beneath him had tilted and he was not used to catching his balance without someone else absorbing the impact. For the first time, he really saw me not as the quiet girl in his house or the nuisance he kept in line, but as someone whose world no longer revolved around his approval. The silence stretched long enough for a family walking past to glance our way, then look quickly away, sensing tension. I took a slow, measured breath. I do not owe you my silence anymore, I said. The words were not planned. They simply rose and settled into the air between us, solid enough to stand on. Mercer stared at me, but the fire in his expression flickered with something smaller underneath. Not anger, not pride, fear. He was not just afraid of losing control over me. He was afraid I had finally realized he had never really had it. I drove back to my apartment that evening with the same folded uniform still lying on the passenger seat where I had left it the night of the Sunday dinner when Mercer told me to take it off at his table. The memory of that humiliation flickered beside the memory of the general calling me Specter in front of hundreds of people. Two worlds still fighting for space inside my mind. I parked and sat there for a moment with the engine off, the silence filling the cabin. For the first time in years, I did not feel small, but I felt something else stirring under the adrenaline. Responsibility. Not the kind handed out in briefings or mission rosters. The kind that came with knowing my mother was still in the house I had escaped. The next morning, after a restless night, I walked into the military family advocacy office on base. The waiting room was bright neutral walls, informational posters, warm lighting that tried to soften the weight people carried in. A staff sergeant greeted me and asked what brought me in. I chose my words carefully. Family-related concerns, Mom. Emotional hardships. Possible financial control issues. She nodded with the kind of understanding that did not need dramatics and guided me to a small office where a counselor listened without interrupting. When she asked if I wanted to speak with Jag as well, I said yes before the question even finished. Within the hour, I was sitting across from a judge advocate whose uniform was crisp and whose expression left no doubt that he took every syllable seriously. I explained the pattern at home, the insults, the belittling, the financial control, the threat he had made in the family section. You move from that seat and I will make one call. We will see how long your clearance lasts. The JAG officer leaned forward, hands folded. Airman, he said, family abuse is a serious matter, whether psychological, financial, or emotional. And a threat involving rank or clearance is an immediate red flag. It could be documented formally. It could trigger review. His voice was not dramatic. It was steady, authoritative, rooted in the kind of certainty people like Mercer hated because it could not be intimidated. I felt something loosen inside me. So all those years of him using his rank to control everything that is not just family conflict, I asked. The officer shook his head. When someone uses their position to coerce or frighten even within the household, it becomes a matter the military takes very seriously. And if he ever does anything on base or in uniform that crosses those lines, there are consequences. Until now, I had believed Mercer's threats because no one had told me otherwise. No one had said I had recourse. The officer continued, "We can start a record. Dates, incidents, any statements he made. It does not mean action right away, but it builds a clear history, one that cannot be ignored. For years, Mercer relied on the fact that in our house, there was no record, only fear. But now, there could be both documentation and accountability. After leaving JAG, I drove to my mother's workplace, a quiet administrative office near Pueblo. She looked tired when she stepped outside to meet me. More tired than a person should look at noon on a weekday. "Mom," I said, "we need to talk." We sat in my car where no one could overhear. I told her I had spoken with advocacy with JAG. I told her financial control was abuse. I told her she had options. She stared at her hands for a long moment. "He handles the money because it keeps things calm," she whispered. "He handles the money because it keeps him in control," I corrected gently. Her eyes lifted to mine. "I do not know how to live without someone telling me what I can spend." The sadness in that sentence hit me harder than any of Mercer's insults. But I had come prepared. I suggested we open a bank account in her name only. I explained I could help her speak with a civilian divorce attorney, no pressure, no timeline, just information so she could know her rights. She hesitated, but she did not say no. She asked quietly, would I even qualify for anything without him standing over everything I do? I told her, yes, absolutely yes. You deserve independence and safety, and a voice not filtered through him. She nodded slowly, absorbing the words like they were foreign. Maybe they were. For years, he had convinced her she was incapable of managing anything on her own. But the military had taught me something he never expected. Systems exist for a reason. Accountability exists for a reason. And no one, not even a colonel, gets to rewrite those rules for personal power. On the drive back to base, I felt the weight of guilt creep in. Guilt for leaving the house at 18. Guilt for building a life where my voice mattered while hers shrank. Guilt for every time I hung up the phone knowing she would return to a man who measured worth by obedience. But alongside the guilt was a new feeling, something steadier, capability. I had tools now, real ones. Knowledge of regulations, advocacy channels, legal structures. Things Mercer could not bend with mood swings or raised voices. Back at JAG to finish initial paperwork, the officer handed me a small notebook. Start here, he said. Write dates. Words, he says. Any threats. Any comments that undermine your work or your clearance. If his behavior crosses lines on base or in uniform, there are consequences. Document everything. I held the notebook in my hand, feeling the textured cover beneath my fingers. It was simple, unremarkable, but it represented something my childhood never had. A place where the truth could be written without being twisted. I slipped it into my uniform pocket and walked out of the building into the clear Colorado air. For the first time, his threats did not echo in an empty room. They landed in someone's notebook under a date and a file number. The first sign that something had shifted came 3 days after the ceremony. I was in the operations building reviewing an overnight intel package when my supervisor paused beside my desk and looked at me with a subtle expression I could not quite read. "You might want to know," he said quietly, "that a memo was filed after the ceremony about what happened in the family section." My pulse tightened, but not with fear. Someone reported it. Someone who had seen Mercer put his hands on my arm tell me to sit, threatened my clearance in earshot of dozens of people. Later I learned it was a major from another unit who had been seated 2 rows behind us. He had written that the conduct was unprofessional, that the comments appeared intentionally belittling toward an active duty airman, and that it raised concerns about misuse of authority. That memo did not exist in a vacuum. It was added to a digital folder that already contained 2 prior informal complaints from drill weekends where Mercer had berated junior members in public, and 1 notation from a chaplain years earlier describing him as overbearing at home. None of those had been enough to spark consequences alone, but together with his behavior toward me in front of a Brigadier General, it formed a pattern that could not be ignored. By the end of the week, Mercer was called into his commander's office for counseling. Not the gentle kind. The official kind that went into his professional record. A counseling statement. The kind that lingered long-term and raised eyebrows during promotion season. His promotion board scheduled for the fall was quietly delayed. A responsibility he held overseeing a training element was reassigned to another officer. Word spread fast in the small ecosystem of Colorado military communities. Soldiers, airmen, civilians, spouses, the circles overlapped more than outsiders realized. It did not take long before people were whispering the version that traveled easiest. Colonel yelled at classified operator in family section. Every retelling made him look worse, and for once the exaggeration did not benefit him. I knew how much reputation mattered to him. Image had always been his armor, his justification for every controlling behavior at home. If people respected him, then his family must obey him. But now the respect was not lining up behind him. It was shifting away. At home, things changed quickly, too. My mother called one morning, her voice shaking in a way I had not heard since childhood. She said quietly, "Kara, I think I want to leave." Those 6 words felt heavier than any classified file I had ever handled. I drove to Pueblo that evening and helped her pack the essentials clothes, important papers, family photographs she had hidden in drawers so he would not throw them out. She stood in the doorway for a full minute, looking around the house she had tried for so long to keep peaceful. Then she whispered almost to herself, "It has never been quiet in here, not once." We loaded her car and mine and drove to a small apartment on the north side of Colorado Springs. I had toured it earlier in the week and helped her sign the lease. It was a modest 1-bedroom, but the moment she stepped inside, she exhaled like a held breath had finally loosened. She looked at the blank walls, the little balcony, the small kitchen, and said, "It is mine." The lack of his control in that space was almost tangible. Meanwhile, Mercer's grip on everything else was slipping. Colleagues began avoiding him in hallways. His commander watched him more closely. Even the young guardsman who once jumped when he barked an order now responded with stiff politeness, not fear. He must have felt the shift because late one evening he called me. His voice was harsher than usual, maybe hoarse, like he had been yelling or pacing. "You need to fix this," he said. "This whole thing has gotten out of hand. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. You owe me that much. Owe him." The man who made my mother hand over her paycheck every month. The man who mocked my job at the dinner table. The man who threatened my clearance in public to put me back in my place. I held the phone to my ear and felt a steadiness anchor in my chest. "I do not owe you my silence anymore." There was a long moment on the line, silent static followed by a low exhale that sounded almost like disbelief or maybe anger that no longer found a place to land. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of the edge. "You think you can just break a family?" he asked bitterly. "You think walking away fixes anything?" I almost laughed, not out of amusement, but out of clarity. He had broken the family years ago. I was simply refusing to live inside the wreckage. After I hung up, I sat in the dark of my living room for a while, letting the quiet settle. The strangest part was how familiar it felt. The quiet of my mother's new apartment, the quiet of my own boundaries finally taking shape, and the quiet that now surrounded Mercer. The man who used to slam his fist on the table to make us jump was suddenly the one being called into offices and told to sit down. A few months later, the sharp edges of that day on the parade field had softened into something I could hold without flinching, the way a scar stops aching, even though you never forget how it got there. Life settled into a new rhythm. Missions briefs, debriefs, the endless cycle of intel work that did not care about family drama, and a quiet domestic pattern I had never known before. My mother adjusted slowly to her apartment on the north side of Colorado Springs, learning how to pay bills online, how to look at a paycheck, and decide for herself where it went, how to fill a grocery cart without hearing his voice in her head tallying every item. I kept working as Specter in the operations cell, and the missions kept coming, each one another thread in a tapestry. No one outside our small community would ever see clearly. One morning, my supervisor stepped by my station and told me to bring my notebook and follow him to a secure conference room. When I walked in, there was a large screen on the far wall already connected to a video call, the small tiles at the top, showing multiple locations, one tagged Pentagon, another tagged with a higher headquarters designation. The agenda on the side of the screen listed several topics in neat bullet points, and halfway down the list I saw it in clear text, Specter review of pattern analysis recommendations. It was a strange thing to see your call sign written on an agenda, that way not as a rumor or a whisper, but as an item that people in distant rooms were expecting to hear from. When my turn came, a colonel on the screen introduced my segment, and the senior official from the Pentagon tile nodded slightly and said, "Specter, we have been following your summaries. Walk us through your assessment." I spoke the way I always did in those rooms, concise, focused, careful, outlining the data, the anomalies, the potential risks, and the recommended adjustments. No one interrupted to mock or dismiss. They asked questions that assumed my competence. When the brief ended, the senior official added, "Specter, your work has prevented more than one situation from becoming a headline. Keep doing what you are doing." The screen shifted to the next agenda item, and the meeting moved on like it was just another day. But somewhere beneath my ribs, something settled a little deeper. My value did not live in the family section. It lived here, in rooms where decisions were made, and my voice was one of the tools used to keep people alive. Later that night, I sat on the small couch in my mother's apartment while a pot of pasta simmered on the stove. The television was on but muted, casting a soft, moving glow across the living room. The space was modest, but every corner felt different from the house in Pueblo. No heavy footsteps, no slammed doors, no constant scanning for his mood, just the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint clink of utensils. My mother stirred the sauce, then leaned back against the counter and looked around with a dazed little smile. I did not realize how loud it was, she said slowly until it was quiet. I watched her say it and thought, that is how trauma sounds when it is gone. Not like a dramatic break, not like fireworks, but like the absence of constant noise. Like being able to hear your own thoughts again. Sometimes at night, when the apartment was still and I was too awake to sleep, I would replay the moment on the parade field, not to savor his humiliation, but to measure the distance between who I had been and who I had become. I would see the general walking past, Mercer hear him say, "Specter, we need you." Hear him tell a crowd that my work had saved an entire unit. I would see myself stepping out of the family section and feel again the strange lightness of realizing that the invisible chains he had wrapped around my identity were never actually attached to anything. They had been made of fear and habit and obligation, all things that could be cut once you understood they were not law. I used to think leaving a person like him would mean I had betrayed family, that choosing my own sanity was some sort of failure of loyalty. But standing in that operations room, sitting at my mother's small kitchen table, hearing her say she had not known what quiet felt like, I finally understood the truth. I wish I had known years earlier. Walking away from someone toxic is not an act of betrayal. It is an act of survival. You are not obligated to protect the reputation of someone who used you as a dumping ground for all their contempt. You do not owe them your silence just because they share your last name or your address. Real rank is not the stripes or eagles or stars pinned to a collar. Real status is not the number of ribbons someone wears in a neat row on their chest. Real status is the choice to stand on your own side even when the people who should have protected you try to convince you that you are nothing without them. I used to measure my worth by how well I could avoid setting him off. Now I measure it by the lives protected when I do my job well and by the quiet safety in an apartment where my mother can fall asleep without bracing for a slammed door. If you have ever been told to sit in the family section and stay quiet only to find out you were carrying more strength than the ones shouting orders at you, tell me still here in the comments. And if you want to stay with me for the next story, maybe the next woman who finally stands up, consider subscribing. Your story might be closer to mine than you think.